evening and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology, and welcome back to our study on Matthew 24. I want to begin to share some thoughts with you regarding the phrase "this generation" in verse 34. And like I said, we're not going to focus in on the Greek word genia. We're going to look at other ways and other hermeneutics that we can prove that this generation does in fact refer to Jesus' first century generation. The first way I want to do that is I want to look at how Jesus applied the phrase "this generation" throughout his ministry and set a biblical precedent for Matthew 24:34. In other words, we're going to interpret and apply this generation in Matthew 24 just like Jesus interpreted and applied it throughout his entire ministry. Here's a fact. 16 times throughout the Gospels, throughout Jesus' ministry, he used the phrase "this generation." 13 of those times were outside of the Olivet Discourse. Here's my argument. If we can demonstrate that in every single one of those 13 times outside of the Olivet Discourse that Jesus used the phrase "this generation," that he was referring to his first century contemporary generation, then when we come to Matthew 24:34, we must interpret it the same way. We must understand it the exact same way that Jesus applied it through his entire ministry. Okay? There's no reason why not to. So let's do this. Let's look at every text in the New Testament except for the parallel text, and I'll make mention of which ones those are, but let's look at every single text where Jesus used the phrase "this generation" in the Gospels and see that in every one of those times, he was referring to his first century contemporary generation. Let's look at Matthew chapter 11 as our first text. And beginning in verse 16, we'll read down to 19. "But to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace who call out to other children and say, 'We played a flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came, neither eating and drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they,'" that's his generation, "'say, Behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.'" I'll stop right there. Now notice, Jesus is comparing how his generation reacted to him and John, and he's comparing that to how these children react to one another in this traditional game they used to play. And he's saying just like a child that doesn't react the way they should in this game, you are not reacting the way you should when to you was sent John the Baptist, and to you was sent the Son of Man. And let me ask you a question. To which generation was John and Jesus sent? Obviously, we don't even have to answer that. We know it was the first century generation. That's the comparison, and that's how Jesus is applying this generation to his generation who didn't react properly to what the prophet said was going to come upon them. Okay? Matthew chapter 12 is our next text. Let's look at this. And let's read verses 38 down to 42. "Then some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, 'Teacher, we want to see a sign from you.'" So who wanted the sign? Scribes and Pharisees of his generation. "But he answered and said to them, 'An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign.'" There it is right there. They crave for the sign. He called them an evil and adulterous generation. Watch this. "And yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Let me ask you a question. What generation witnessed the sign of the prophet Jonah as the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ? Well, Jesus' generation is the only generation that would and could ever see his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And watch this. Speaking of the prophet Jonah, Jonah was sent to a city to call them to repentance or else they would be judged. That's exactly what Jesus did. He was sent to Israel to call them to repentance or else judgment was coming. And that's where we get the next couple of verses. That's where they come in. Look at verse 41. "The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, a greater than Jonah is here." Now he's saying this generation, and he's referring to a greater than Jonah came to this generation. What generation did Jesus, the greater than Jonah, come to? His generation. You see how all this generation language applies to his generation in Matthew 12? Very, very obvious. From there, let's go to Matthew chapter 23. Obviously, a very familiar text here. I'm going to read verses 34 down to 36 and 38. "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you," who's the you? Scribes and Pharisees. "You will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zachariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And if that's not enough, look at verse 38. Jesus identifies who this generation is. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. In what generation was the house of Judaism and the temple completely desolated in? Obviously, that happened in AD 70. That was his generation. From there, let's go to Mark chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. Says, the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in spirit, he said, why does this generation seek a sign? The scribes and the Pharisees of his generation sought a sign, and he referred to this as those people. Luke 7 is another text where this generation is used, but we're not going to look at that because that parallels Matthew chapter 11. Luke 11, 29 through 32, Jesus uses the phrase this generation several times, but once again, that parallels Matthew 12, which we've already demonstrated, applies to Jesus' generation. And Luke 11, 47 to 51 uses the phrase this generation, but that parallels Matthew 23, which obviously applies to Jesus' generation. So the last text we'll look at is Luke chapter 17. Verses 24 and 25 say this. For just like the lightning when it flashes out of one part of heaven and shines to the other part of heaven, so will the Son of Man be in his day. But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. Let me ask you, and we know the answer. What generation did Jesus suffer and was he rejected by? His generation. Look, we've gone through either explicitly or implicitly every single text where Jesus uses the phrase this generation. And we've shown you that every single time this generation refers to his first century contemporary generation. That means when we get to Matthew 24, 34, and its parallel texts, this generation must refer to Jesus' first century generation. There is no way around it. There's no biblical precedent. There's no biblical authority to interpret it otherwise. We must interpret this generation, Matthew 24, just like Jesus applied it and interpreted through his entire ministry. That's the only way. That's the only way. That's the only reason. That's the only logical explanation. And we got lots more to say and lots more ways to demonstrate this generation refers to Jesus' generation. And we'll do that next time on Answers in Eschatology. I'm taking the weekend off. You won't see me Friday. We'll see you Monday. Have a fantastic weekend, and God bless.